which is so rich and so interesting. I mean, this guy did everything. Um, that you can come to right here on biography.com. They also have it in video form if that's preferable. Going back to Canvas and to the home page. There's a discussion board, which I will show you after we take a look at this at my introduction to the story itself. So the PowerPoint is here. It will open better again on PC. I'm doing this on my Mac and still learning, how to go from one system to the next, so bear with me. My introduction to Scandal in Bohemia. Let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger without totally obscuring my face. So, Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1859 to Irish Catholic parents. So I think it's really interesting as a citizen of, um, you know, Britain that he is of Irish heritage, living in Scotland, and became a popular British author. Um, he was a physician and a writer, most noted, of course, for the Sherlock Holmes stories. Um, pardon me. He graduated from medicine in 1881 from Edinburgh University. He practiced abroad. He was on a Greenland whaling ship. He, worked with West African traders. He worked at a Boer War hospital in South Africa. I mean, the guy had a very rich life. One thing that I find really fascinating about him is he was an avid spiritualist, which is a huge movement. We didn't get a big chance. We didn't get any chance, because we're not in class, to discuss about the Victorian era. Um, about Charles Dickens was big into mesmerism, that you could get into, put someone in a state of hypnosis and like pull out secrets, and people believed you could speak to ghosts, and there were all these hoaxes. You should look into the hoax about fairies. There were the Conningham fairies, where some girls cut out fairies, like paper fairies, and put them next to them, like on flowers, and took photos and said, "Look, fairies are real." Conan Doyle totally believed it. He was a huge spiritualist. He and Houdini actually had a showdown because Houdini was very anti-spiritualism, and Conan Doyle's wife said, "Oh, I talked to your dead mother," to Houdini, and Houdini's like, "My mother didn't speak English," and crazy. So big tangent, but I think it's interesting that Conan Doyle's so famous for his Sherlock Holmes stories, which are all about, rationality and logic and science. And he was this huge spiritualist, completely believed in being able to, speak to the dead. And there's just other realms that we can't see, but that do exist. So Sherlock Holmes first appeared in 1887. The one we were reading is not his first story. I think it's about 3 or 4 years later. The first one was A Study in Scarlet. He had 56 short stories, 4 novels. At one point, you might know that he killed off Sherlock Holmes. He had him, fall over the waterfall with Moriarty. Fans were so ticked off and, insistent that Sherlock Holmes come back. He wrote him, back to life. Um, I mean, he was very much inspired. I don't want to say that he was the first detective. A lot of people give that title to Edgar Allan Poe as creating the first literary detective that very much influenced Conan Doyle. He has a brother. We won't get there. I love how this typo is Microsoft is Mycroft Holmes. I definitely ripped this particular slide from the internet. They got that wrong. And he is English. Habits and personality. I love this slide. Watson describes Holmes as Bohemian. So Bohemian, I always think of Bohemian Rhapsody. My kids love that song. Sorry, big tangent. But if you've seen like the movie Moulin Rouge, right, it's to live on the periphery of society and to kind of make your own rules and not to bow to convention. Um, Holmes is eccentric with no regard for contemporary standards of tidiness or good order. What appears to others as chaos is to Holmes a wealth of useful information. Throughout the stories, Holmes would dive into the apparent mess of random papers and artifacts only to retrieve precisely the specific document or other eclectic item he was looking for. Reminds me of my office mate's desk that I could never live with, but he knows where everything is. In matters of hygiene, by contrast, Holmes is described as having a cat-like love of cleanliness, and his chronicler does not consider Holmes' habitual use of the pipe, cigarettes, and cigars a vice. Again, up until like the 1940s, they said that smoking tobacco was good for you. He did occasionally use cocaine. There's so many theories about Sherlock Holmes. Modern critics sometimes see him as being on the spectrum. Some think that he seems asexual, or perhaps he was, closeted homosexual. I mean, his character is just, it's fascinating for the lack of what's there, if that makes sense. Like, there's not a lot of emotional development. He is very much that detective. So the character, first appeared in 1887. Um, and there's some more feedback here I will let you dig into, and recommendations on other stories and novels that you can watch. The narrator is interesting to think of because the one we're reading, the narrator is Watson, right? His sidekick. Um, a couple are narrated by Holmes himself, and a lot have this omniscient narrator, right? Like just someone telling us the story from like almost from above. Scandal in Bohemia is what we are doing, what we are looking at this week. It's not the first story, it's the first one in a series, so if that makes sense, for Strand Magazine. It was illustrated by Sidney Paget, so those are the illustrations that I chose to post to Canvas. At the start of the story, Watson says he has seldom heard Holmes call Irene Adler by anything but the woman. However, in every other story in which she is mentioned, he calls her Irene Adler, meaning Watson. Holmes received a gold snuff box from the King of Bohemia for handling this case, and we will delve into it. So there's the King of Bohemia and Holmes and Watson. So you might have seen, or you probably, I don't say probably, might have seen the Robert Downey Jr. version of Sherlock Holmes where Rachel McAdams plays Irene Adler. Um, she's American. She's an adventurous, which is, a nice way of saying perhaps promiscuous and out to enjoy life and to travel without a chaperone. Very, very blue stocking, very, independent woman. She's brilliant. And so I think it throws a lot of people off that she's conventionally beautiful and she's brilliant. Um, but she's very much Holmes' equal and the other side of him, in that she is, of course, feminine to masculine, and so socially adept where Holmes is socially awkward, and she has the emotional side that he lacks. So let's take a look. So Adler versus Holmes, with her femininity and quicker wit, Adler represents what Holmes is missing in this story. There are two parts of the whole. Adler is the female Holmes. She's his equal rather than the villain. So he is going up against her in this one, but she's not a Moriarty, right? She has her agenda, but she's certainly not evil. And the quote from the story, you do not know her. She has a soul of steel. She has the face of the most beautiful woman and the mind of the most resolute of men. Although, and then this is a critic who writes a lot about Sherlock Holmes, says, although Holmes defeated, he reacts like a true Victorian gentleman, for despite a marked sting to his ego, he cannot hide his deep admiration for this exceptional woman. And the last slide I want to look at here about Holmes as an abstract representation. Holmes himself is a representation of the eccentric bohemian, but so is Adler, right? They both don't follow the rules of society. The narrator Watson describes Holmes as a precise thinking machine, but does so with very passionate words, showing that Holmes does in fact have the capability of emotion, which he later shows for Adler. I'm going to ruin the ending of the story in that she defeats him in a way. And it's the only story where Holmes is ever defeated or outwitted. And it's significant. And it's also important that she's a woman, right, at this time. This is the end of the Victorian era, but those Victorian conventions for women are very much in vogue. And she outsmarts him. And he responds with admiration. And that is why this BBC version pisses me off so much. And again, sorry for my language, in that I was watching it, I'm like, okay, it's well done. I like how they've modernized it, and I like how they developed the characters. Okay, they've changed the storyline. He gets the best of her in the end, the same way that she does him. And it ticks me off because they've undone all the radical things that Conan Doyle was doing in terms of gender roles at the time. So I will leave it at that. Between the two clips I've posted, you can get a sense of it. I believe it's available on Netflix if you want to watch the episode. And when it comes to paper two, I'm talking May 16th, I've had students write fascinating papers about how Sherlock Holmes is represented in the media. If you think about all these detective shows, those that recommend, like I mentioned him specifically, like Sherlock or Elementary is the modern one with Lucy Liu. Even shows like Bones and things like that have borrowed from it so much. I've had a great paper just comparing this story to that episode of the BBC version of Holmes. So keep that in mind. So your discussion board, I noticed people really liked the freedom um, of writing about what they wanted to or what they found interesting. So what I've done is this, kind of met you in the middle. If your last name begins with A through K, carefully read the Doyle biography and the story. And then I want you to just, so you've read the whole story, but focus on the beginning. Focus on pages 6 through 12 and write a thoughtful paragraph, 6 to 10 sentences with citations about any aspect you found interesting. So focus on a character or a theme or an item or a habit or something that you find fascinating. Like I loved how, particularly, I think it was Nick and Harry were fascinated by the setting in Jekyll and Hyde. Find what you find interesting here and just go to town. But if your last name is between A through K, stick to pages 6 through 12. And you can imagine, same thing, if your last name is L through Z, read the whole thing, but I want you to focus on what you find interesting in the second half, pages 12 through 20. Okay? So that's due before Thursday night. And then before Sunday, find someone who posted on the other half of the story, right? Um, so Harry would have posted on the first half. Caitlin will post on the second half. So Caitlin's going to find someone who posted on the first half and respond to them for Sunday. So make sure you've got those citations, the critical thinking. I don't want to say anymore because I don't want to step on the story for you. So take your time with it. Contact me with questions. I've got office hours, email. We can set up a conference and keep up the good work. Don't stop.